This program is made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, Maryland Humanities Council, Maryland and Howard County Arts Council, Howard County General Hospital, and the Thai Sophia Institute.
Welcome to The Writing Life. My name is Michael Collier, and I'm speaking with Jane Hirshfield today. Jane is a poet, editor, essayist, co-translator, and she's the author of 6 books of poems. The most recent is After, which was published in 2006. She's been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and has won fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Academy of American Poets. Jane, welcome. It's good to see you.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And I thought maybe we could start the conversation with you reading a poem or two that has to do with the art of poetry, or the process that you use, or what you think about as you're putting poems together. And there's a lovely poem in the Lies of the Heart called The Poet. And I thought maybe you could read that.
I would be glad to.
Start with that.
This is a poem that I wrote. I suppose it has something to do with process in that I wrote it when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Study Center for Scholars and Artists on Lake Como in Italy. And this is a place where there has been a villa on this piece of land since Pliny the Elder. And the current one, I believe, dates back to the 17th century. And I was totally overwhelmed at being there. It just seemed implausible, nor was it a way of living that was particularly natural to me. And for the first week that I was there, I wrote, because it was, too good an opportunity not to, but I wrote rather badly, and I was trying to figure out what is throwing me so off balance. And I realized it was, in fact, that it felt like unearned luck, because such a situation can never be earned, And I became very aware of my own awareness of how many people would never have such an opportunity, and then began thinking of people who work in circumstances where they might not even have electricity, they might not have paper, they might not have a chair, they might not have a room of their own. And even if they did manage to get their work done, that they could be working in countries where there's no chance of publication, they could be working in places where their poems would never reach the possibility of being translated, that I would never see them. And yet my absolute confidence that it is terribly important to me that those poems exist, and it changes the world that those poems exist. And so all of that sort of background of guilt, in a way, led to this poem, which then freed me to write for the rest of this day, having passed through its gate. So it's called The Poet. She is working now in a room not unlike this one, the one where I write or you read. Her table is covered with paper. The light of the lamp would be tempered by a shade where the bulb's single harshness might dissolve, but it is not. She has taken it off. Her poems, I will never know them, though they are the ones I most need. Even the alphabet she writes in, I cannot decipher. Her chair, let us imagine whether it is leather or canvas, vinyl or wicker. Let her have a chair, her shadeless lamp, the table. Let one or two she loves be in the next room. Let the door be closed, the sleeping ones healthy. Let her have time and silence, enough paper to make mistakes and go on.
So after you wrote this poem, it felt as if you you use the phrase, you went through the gates.
Yeah, I had liberated myself from my own discomfort
Yeah.
because I had managed to include, at least in my mind, the acknowledgement
Yeah.
of the fact that this was unearned luck,
Right.
that this was a life. You know, how does poetry bring you to a villa in
Right.
Italy?
Yeah.
And somehow, once I had opened the gates of my consciousness and my awareness to the fact that great poetry is being written regardless of circumstance, regardless of my ever seeing it, it was as though I had put to sleep the guard dog
Yeah.
that was preventing me from working. I had fed it, not put it to sleep, but fed it, given it what it needed, and then with, in a way, this imagined woman poet's permission to continue. By blessing her and wishing her continuance, I was in that odd way of in the empathy of literature, also blessing my own work,
Right.
which you can't do directly. You can only do by acknowledging outward.
Right. You know, one of the things, there are actually two things that interest me a lot, and one is the line that I will never know them, though they are the ones I most need.
Yes.
And the necessity of poetry, the sense that it's something that people need, that people are hungry for.
Yes.
And that it gets created regardless of circumstances.
Right.
That seems to be central not only in this poem, but in your work. And I just wondered if there are other things you might say about that, about the necessity.
Well, for me, I think I began to write as a very young person because it was a way for me to craft and know and create a self. It was a pathway into being human and knowing what it is to be human that the outward circumstances of my life were in no way fostering. I didn't grow up in an environment that acknowledged the deep aspects of life. It was you know, I don't want to condemn my childhood, which was in many ways also a lucky childhood, but depth of awareness and consciousness and thinking and questioning were not necessarily in the foreground. And yet from earliest childhood, I hungered for a larger existence. I looked around and I knew there was more. I grew up in an apartment in a project in New York City. It was a very nice project, but nonetheless, this is not a broad existence. You know, it's a very human-made, narrow environment. And my earliest memory as a child is of my earliest trip when I was taken to the country. And I think I, you know, lay on my back at 2 years old and opened my eyes to blue sky. And behind my head there must have been a blackberry hedge, because I remember the sweetness of blackberries in my mouth and this dark plant life behind me and sky overhead. And something in me said, yes, there is a larger world and I will make my way towards it however I can. And for me, literature was that way. Other people's poems opened worlds to me. The first book I ever bought was a book of Japanese haiku. Now, what is a young girl in New York going to make of these nature poems translated from the Japanese? But something in them absolutely drew me forward at 8 years old, and has continued to draw me forward.
I wonder, one of the poems that you have that I think is terrific is called Identity. And I wonder if part of what you're talking about is how you create a self, how you, in fact, create an identity.
Right.
And maybe it would be good to read that from your collection, Given Sugar, Given Salt.
Right. I mean, that poem is interesting because I also, of course, have, well, I shouldn't say of course, I know this, others may not. I have a certain skepticism of identity, in that there is the necessity is an authentic self. The danger is an ego-based, narrow self which limits a life and which creates between human beings the sense of I am this, you are that, we are separate, therefore many, many bad things happen. So I have a deeply ambivalent relationship to the question of identity, and I myself find that identity politics are the source only of grief in this world. And what this poem is investigating, which perhaps I should say after rather than before I read it, but I'm saying it before, what it's investigating is the fact that what we do and who we are, in fact, never can be undone, and that you cannot step outside of what might appear to be the clothing of a life, in fact, does become to some degree the life, even if you've left it. So let me read the poem. Identity. Decades after a man leaves the church, still he is called the priest. Many years since she set down her bow, a woman remains the cellist. The one who seduced so many is content now to sip her tea, and still she is looked at with envy and hatred. The one who held life and death in his mouth no longer speaks at all, yet still he is feared. The unmoving dancer rehearses her steps. Again, perfection eludes her. Fate loosens its grip. The bruises stay. So we become our choices, as one of my poems says in one of its lines. One could say that it's a poem about the accumulation of your decisions being something you cannot ever turn your back on once they've been made. And yet behind it also, I do have this feeling of identity as permeable, as malleable, that in any moment any of us can become a different person. I read this poem when I was meeting with a group of university students in Istanbul earlier this year. And I read it thinking that identity is so much at the heart of the difficulties in Turkey now, the Kurds, the Armenians, the Turks, the pride in country, and the fact that you can be jailed for insulting the country. And I just wanted to raise a question for those students of, is this necessarily a good thing?
One of the, that would be a fascinating place to read this poem and get a reaction from them. One of the things I thought about when I read it is, I was thinking about the identity of a poet and how the identity of a poet is, well, I was thinking of Auden's notion that he only would claim he was a poet when he was writing.
Yes.
And after that, you really can't claim you're a poet.
Absolutely true.
And yet, as a poet, you can take on almost any identity, and that's your job.
Yes, well, that's what the last chapter in the essay book, Nine Gates, is basically about the writer as a person who lives within the threshold, in the sense of anthropological descriptions of rite of passage. There's always a moment in a transition between identified stage of lives when in a culture that gives rituals to acknowledge these things, there's a moment when you're nobody and no one. And I think the artist's job and the writer's job is to be in that condition of permeability, because then you speak not for the narrow life but for the large, and you are able to give voice to the voiceless, and you are able to see things not through the eyes of your own wants and needs, but through the eyes perhaps of the world's own wants and needs. I mean, Basho said something very close to what Auden said, but he said it about the poem itself. He said, the poem only exists while it is on the writing desk. After that, it's just another piece of paper.
Yeah, that's wonderful. In your book, After, there are a series of poems called Assays. And there's one called Sky, which I wonder if you would read that and also talk about a little, because I have a sense that as poets, poets create or stumble upon and find identities. And this seems to be one of the, you could think of this as an identity, and an assay as a way of analyzing or measuring some aspect of experience, or as you do, words and ideas and things.
Right.
So if you could read that poem.
Sky and Assay. A hawk flies through it, carrying a still twisting snake twice the length of its body. Radiation, smoke, mosquitoes, the music of Mahler fly through it. The sky makes room, adjusting its airy shoulders. Sky doesn't age or remember, carries neither grudges nor hope. Every morning is new as the last one, uncreased as the not quite imaginable first. From the fate of thunderstorms, hailstorms, fog, sky learns no lesson, leaping through any window as soon as it's raised. In speech, furious or tender, it's still of passing sky the words are formed. Whatever sky proposes is out in the open. Clear even when not, sky offers no model, no mirror, cloudy or bright, to the ordinary heart, which is secretive, rackety, domestic, harboring a wild uninterest in sky's disinterest. And so we look right past sky, by it, through it, to what also is moody and alters, erosive mountains, eclipsable moons, stars distant but death-bound.
So, how would you start writing a poem like this? Can you remember what you began with, and then how it accumulates? Because one of the marvelous things about it is just how it moves around.
Right.
And it's very nimble in that way, and the transitions can be stark, but you never feel as if you've lost connection.
Thank you.
Yeah, it moves around beautifully.
Right. Well, that was the voice of these poems which are labeled Assays. That's in fact what makes them what they are, is, you know, a type of poem is a mood and a mode, both. And for me, the Assays were always an investigation of whatever substance or feeling they were looking at, or idea, or word. Some of them were about little words like ah, or to, or and. But what they were trying to do was to disassemble it and see what it was made of, not in the way that a $500,000 assaying machine that one would have in a chemistry lab does, but in the way that the poetic mind does. And what it does is it leaps to different qualities of this thing. And they're a little bit prosy, they're a little bit essay-like. The word assay and essay are cognates, they have the same root. And so, in a way, the thing I was trying to do was come at the subject from every side. And in the case of this one, I really did see a hawk flying, carrying a snake on one of my hikes. But the poem doesn't get written, especially an assay, but for me, any poem, there might be an image or an idea, but there is not a poem until there is music, until there is a voice that has a rhythm and a tone, a beat, a sound aliveness, a heightened awareness of the physicality of speech. And only when that is present does it then become not just my mind, you know, musing around, but actually, oh, I'm writing a poem now.
And from that you begin, and from that you begin to get a sense of its form as well?
Yeah. And you know, the form of stanzas with separation. I mean, Sky itself, I liked the way you went to this, because I never actually thought of it as a poem about identity, but it is completely a poem about identity, and that, you know, the sky itself, which we look past, by, and through it, because it in itself is nothing. It holds things. And what I was interested in, you know, I sort of knew I really had a poem when I got to the third line about radiation, smoke, mosquitoes, the music of Mahler fly through it. Its total permeability to anything we put in it. Air pollution, radio waves, what it already lives in it, birds and bugs. And then I had my subject matter, my deeper subject matter, without thinking about it. It was simply there. Permeability interests me. Identity interests me. The fluidity of existence interests me. And to end a poem, of course, I think no poem actually becomes a poem until something has happened that allows you, whether writer or reader, to know the world differently than you would have if you hadn't read it. If the world isn't a little altered by your passage through a poem, it's not really a poem. It's just a bunch of lines in verse.
Do you think there's is there a moment in this poem where, it might not be exactly where it happens for the reader, but is there a moment where you, as a writer, recognized, maybe not in the fullness of that recognition, but it became mysterious to you, or you knew you had sort of passed through that point?
Yeah, and for me it is, you know, very, very near the end, when I realized that what I had been making my way towards without knowing it yet was this contrast between the neutrality, openness, and capaciousness of Sky and our human lives, which are secretive, rackety, domestic, and they're not interested in disinterest. They want to love. Our hearts live in life, loss, love, grief, feeling, transience, everything. What do we look through Sky for? Stars which are going to vanish, mountains which are going to erode, moons which are going to be eclipsed. We love what is like us, which is what is fragile, breakable, and will be lost. And that for me was a kind of realization. I'd never thought of it in quite that way before.
I want to tell you, one of the experiences I had reading this poem is that towards the end, I had the image of things falling out of the sky. In other words, the poem is kind of pushing us through it and to see it, but you know, as you read a poem, sometimes you're helping write your own version of it. And that's what I kept putting into the poem. And for me, that's the sign, one of the signs that a poem has created a world for the reader, and that is the reader finds a way in which, you know, he or she is measuring one's own sense of the experience of, let's say, something like
it
Sky.
has to matter enough to you to have its own meaning in your own life. And that's, you know, I think sometimes we write poems which maybe only matter to us, and sometimes we write poems which other people can also enter. And
well, don't you think you always have, I mean, this is one thing I talk with students about all the time when they're afraid of cutting things out of a poem. I tell them, look, you always know it's there. You know the history of the poem from the first word to the last, and no matter, you know, what you take out or what you add in, that's the poem that you possess. In the poem, the reader doesn't possess it, and that's the it's not so much the advantage the poet has, but it's the larger experience that the poet has, is to be cognizant of everything that went in or was taken out.
And nothing is ever lost. You know, if that was a necessary discovery, it will come back in another poem. It might not serve one poem, but then it can come and serve another.
There's a poem, one of my favorite poems, is Like an Ant Carrying Her Bits of Leaf and Sand. And this might also be a way, not so much talking about identity, but talking about what we as humans see in experience and need back from experience.
Like an ant carrying her bits of leaf or sand. Like an ant carrying her bits of leaf or sand, the poem carries its words, moving one, then another into place. Something in an ant is sure where these morsels belong, but the ant could not explain this. Something in a poem is certain where its words belong, but the poet could not explain this. All day the ant obeys an inexplicable order. All day the poet obeys an incomprehensible demand. The world changes or does not change by these labors. The geode peeled open gives off its cold scent or does not. But that is no concern of the ants, of the poems. The work of existence devours its own unfolding. What dissolves will dissolve. You, reader, and I, and all our quick angers and longings, the potato's sugary hunger for growing larger, the unblinking heat of the tiger. No thimble of cloud or stone that will not vanish, and still the rearrangements continue. The ant's work belongs to the ant. The poem carries love and terror, or it carries nothing.
And one of the things that I found arresting about this poem, and it's really throughout the whole book, is the sense that there's love, but there's also terror.
Yeah.
There's, I think another poem says blessing and horror, blessings and horror.
Yeah.
And that's a way of being fair to experience, it seems to me, and not to tell the reader that experience is all love. And it comes through your poems again. I wonder if that's something that, in this book in particular, you're trying to work through, or do you feel it's always a pressure and a tension in the work?
I think, you know, a poet doesn't necessarily know her or his own themes when they're starting out, but at this point, when I look back, I can see through all my work from the beginning that that's a theme which is absolutely omnipresent. And, you know, maybe the saying of it clarified further over time. But I think for me, one of the roles of poetry in my life, why it has been necessary for me, is because it instructs me in the possibilities of fully agreeing to a 360-degree life.
Right.
You know, we all would like things to be easy, to only know love and never know loss, to only know increase and never know the lessening of our strengths and our powers and our world. But, you know, as this poem says, you know, everything will be taken from us, everything. And my task as a human being is to embrace not just the easily affirmed, but also the thing which we want to push away. And rather than to blind myself to it or to find some easy agreement, which I think there are certain philosophies of life which make it all very easy. And what I hunger for is, in fact, to say yes to the most difficult things that life is going to give me. And poetry lets me do that. It shows me a way to do it.
We have time for a short poem.
Okay.
So why don't we try and close with a short poem of your choice?
Okay, this is a poem. I live in a town called Mill Valley, which is named after a mill that took all the redwood trees off Mount Tamalpais, sent them over the Golden Gate Bridge to rebuild San Francisco after the '06 earthquake and fire. The trees, being redwoods, come back. It is the nature of redwoods to go for second growth, and so this is a poem about one of those trees close to me. Tree. It is foolish to let a young redwood grow next to a house. Even in this one lifetime, you will have to choose. That great calm being, this clutter of soup pots and books. Already the first branch tips brush at the window. Softly, calmly, immensity taps at your life.
Jane, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I wish we had more time.
Well, it's been a pleasure seeing you.
It's in the nature of these things to just sort of start to get going, and then you run out of time. But thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us for The Writing Life.